Well, hello, everyone. I just wanted to offer this brief overview of pastoral care and kind of an introduction to that. And for the most part, on the beginning of this, really try to distinguish two um, parts of what we'll do or educate you on or equip you with this semester. And that's really distinguishing between pastoral care and pastoral counseling. Yet all of it is inclusive of caring for parishioners, the flock, or those that you may be attending to. So I want to distinguish that piece, though, the counseling piece. And again, that's one of my excitements about teaching this course because I have the distinct privilege of being able to serve in both of those capacities in much of the work that I do as a counselor educator, as an actual clinician, and as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I wanted to just kind of distinguish some of those roles, but at the same time give you an overview and a foundation and framework for why we really do this kind of work, going back to the early church. So, again, I kind of explained that already, really just distinguishing those roles and activities of pastoral care versus the interventions. And that's probably the key word to keep in mind there as we talk about the difference between the two. When you get involved in more counseling role, attending role, pastoral counseling, where you're going to be using interventions to work with those individuals. With pastoral care, it's more activities, but in both presence, being present with those. As I learned so much in my work as the pastoral care uh, uh, pastor at my former church, is that we would go to funerals for members of our church. And like I said, at that time, we probably had 5,000 people on the rolls at that church. And it was not possible for the pastor to go and go to all those funerals of people who had loved ones to pass away. But we would send as best we could deacons, representatives of the church to the funerals of individuals really across the country. If they had a loved one and they went to school, went to church here in Texas, but they had family in Mississippi, we would try to send a representative to those funerals, or more than one sometimes, or a group of congregants would go. But what we would do is offer a ministry of presence. We didn't need to speak. We didn't need to read a resolution. We didn't need to do anything. But if we just show up for those members, it meant the world to them in the process of their grieving. So the ministry of presence is so real, and that will occur in both care and in counseling. And I also want to just kind of mention throughout this course, you will have an opportunity to kind of talk about the ethics and boundaries of both roles because you do want to maintain some boundaries with individuals as you're working with them and still love them. You can do that. So let's kind of distinguish this care and counseling. And I don't like to even use the term versus counseling because it's almost like they're opposing each other. They're not opposing each other. We just want you to be able to distinguish the differences in one to the next. Pastoral care is more about meeting needs of the parishioners of a congregation, resourcing, finding resources for those attendees, for parishioners, uh, if you will. Sometimes we'll call them clients. I usually like to use the term client when we're talking about more of a clinical role, so that you can kind of distinguish individuals. But either way, it's fine. They can still be clients. It's not typically in pastoral care, there's not a lot of charging or fees being charged to bring someone in for pastoral counseling. So I usually try to use the term more just your care and attending to those individuals. But it's big on resourcing, finding resources for members or those individuals you're working with. I heard some of the ministries that some of you are working in. You may be finding things to help folks deal with sex addiction or what have you, or resources, local groups that can offer that support. So you're really in charge of that when you're doing pastoral care. And sitting, I would say, even putting systems in place to take care of the care of those that you're attending to. Um, Another thing is really to offer some redirection, some guidance. If you have that gift uh, in either in Romans 12 or in 1 Corinthians 12, where it talks about exhortation. The ability to exhort is really to kind of give guidance and direct others and pour into them. It really comes from that word in the Greek, paraklesos, which is or where we get the word paraklesis, which is to come alongside and to comfort. And if you have that gift, which you probably all do, or it's somewhere in that ballpark, or you probably wouldn't even be in this course, you wouldn't be in this degree program that you're in. Many of you are in this ministry formation um, or spiritual formation tract, and I don't know all the names of them on the ministry side but you all know exactly what I'm speaking of. You probably have, and I listened to all four of you in our first class, and you spoke about what you plan to do or what you were praying about, and I heard from you a desire to come alongside and to comfort others. So that's really what pastoral care is all about in general. Now, there is a distinguishing piece here. I don't want to say it's more than, but you may go a little bit further in doing what's called pastoral counseling. That's where you again get involved by using interventions. You may use individual time with individuals, group time, like a small group, or couples. But the key to this is listening before anything. And as we start talking about attending skills, the attending skills will let us know that you are already practicing that basic skill of what? Listening. And the goal of that is to help our attendees, when you're doing pastoral counseling, to kind of do some retrospect and some introspect, i.e., looking back on their lives, looking back on situations, looking back on how they've handled previous situations, but at the same time, looking inside at the emotions, what's coming up for them, and calling those kinds of things out. So that's more pastoral counseling. At the end of the day, just like pastoral care, we're trying to instill hope. We're trying to share uh, the love of Christ in a very, very practical way. And you are able to instill hope just by being present. Folks, you might not believe it, but just being present with someone can give them the hope. And then assisting with change and thinking behaviors. This is where it gets to be more intervention-y, maybe. It's not a real word, but to be more of an interventionist is where you're trying to create tools, identify things to help the attendee to change behaviors, change thinking, so that they can function at a higher level. And also know when to refer them out to a licensed clinician to do more of the clinical work on that back end. So just kind of being able to distinguish that, and we'll talk a little bit about that over the period of these weeks that we're in the course. And then you're really trying to help the attendee follow a plan of treatment. And let me go ahead and just up front let you know as I'm kind of walking through these slides. Take your time watching this video. You don't have to watch it all at once. You probably will get some instructions noting that because this tends to be a little bit lengthy, but you'll have it to be able to reference back to and focus on later in terms of gathering content for some of the work that you plan to be doing. One of my favorite Bible lessons of which to preach from, teach from, share from, I think it inspires my theoretical orientation of counseling, is that of the parable of the Good Samaritan that comes from Luke chapter 10. I remember being in my doctoral program, and when we were talking about our potential theoretical orientation in a counseling theory, advanced counseling theory course, and they said, "What inspires your theoretical orientation?" And me knowing that I was really leaning into more of a person-centered theory of it being about the client, embracing the client, encouraging the client through just the therapeutic relationship. It's all about the therapeutic relationship in person-centered theory. I leaned into the into the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, of course, by my bio here, I love narrative therapy as well. I love narrative because I think there's a story in everyone's life, but I do that with a person-centered approach. I really even try to integrate those two theories there. in what I do. And it takes one that is in a relationship with one to hear the story of another, where they trust you with their story. So that's the other piece, but not to belabor that. I don't want to go off on a tangent about that. But right now, I'm talking about my one of my key theoretical orientations of counseling is really being a person-centered therapist and building a relationship there. So let's look at the parable of the Good Samaritan and kind of get some background information on it. So I have it here. I'm just kind of looking at it over here on my other screen here. If you remember that story of the man that was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and he fell among robbers, they stripped him, they beat him, and pretty much walked away and left him for dead. Just some history on that. The Jericho Road was really a treacherous terrain, as you can kind of see by this picture. That's probably not treacherous enough from what I've understood in some of my reading. But it's a treacherous terrain, rocks, very hilly, windy road. And when one would travel on that road, it was very, very dangerous. But at the same time, it was dangerous because of criminal activity. And of course, Jesus uses this road in his scenario. It's a real road, and he uses this story as if, hey, imagine if someone was walking on that treacherous road to Jericho. Well, that road to Jericho runs between where you'd have travelers on that would be either Jews or Samaritans. And if you look at the history of the biblical text, even going back to the book of Nehemiah, there was great friction between Jews and Samaritans, a form of just marginalization, a dislike, disdain from both groups in that particular area. And then Jesus introduces, in addition to this man that's been left for dead, we know nothing about the man, know nothing about his background, whether he's a Jew, whether he's a Gentile, Samaritan, anything. We just know that three individuals came by when he was there: a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. Kind of sounds like a joke that someone would tell you. A priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan walked into a bar. Well, in this particular parable, Jesus talks about three individuals, two that were a part of the key religious institutions of that day: a priest, a Levite. And the priest would have been one that had major temple restrictions. They cannot come within 6 feet of a dead body, cannot come within 6 feet of a dead body. If they do, they would be considered ceremonially unclean. So, what does that mean to the priest? He would no longer have his job. Now, a Levite didn't have as many restrictions as a priest, but that Levite would have some restrictions. He can't touch a dead body, or he would be ceremonially unclean. But he can at least, he could see or become closer to the body, but he couldn't touch the body. And so we see that both the priest and the Levite walk by. The priest doesn't even pay any regards to it. It even says about the Levite, it said that he came and he looked and still went by on the other side. So he would have been able to get closer, but not touching him. Jesus used all the history within this in the culture and the religious culture within this particular parable. But we see that the one person, one who would have been hated by Jews in the audience that Jesus was talking to were scribes and Pharisees, the one that would have been hated by them was a Samaritan. And he became the one that would help the man. The man was a victim. We don't know what his background was. We don't know whether he was a Jew, a Gentile, Samaritan. We don't know anything. But the Samaritan, without regards, came to the man's assistance. And that's the attitude that we have to have as we're doing pastoral care. We serve others without regards to who they are, but we remember what? It's a lot of times they say in church, whose they are: God's people, God's creation. And so in that parable, we see verse 30 that some trauma has been experienced by this man that's been left for dead. It's sin invoked because it was robbers, thieves that had stripped him and taken everything from him. So even stripping him, you would not have known who the man was in terms of his garb or what have you. So you wouldn't even be able to identify if he was a Jew or not. And so left there. Um, Gross apathy on behalf of the religious leaders of that day, the priest and the Samaritan, I mean, the priest and the Levite. And we see the recognition by the Samaritan, which is a layperson who's just generally walking down the road, and he comes and he provides aid to the man. He was led on by compassion. It says he felt compassion in verse 33. And he came up, bandaged his wounds. He didn't care about um, the discharge of blood, anything like that. He really went and cared for the man. He put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. That would have cost this Samaritan money. But he was invoked by compassion. He addressed the needs and he served sacrificially because he said to the innkeeper, anything that it costs to take care of this man, let me know and I will pay that as well when I return to you. So, a sacrificial giving. You have to give of yourself when you're doing ministry and inspiring others to do the same work. And this in this particular passage really encourages others to do the same work because in verse 37, Jesus said, "The one who showed when the man responded to Jesus, the scribe responded to Jesus. He says, after Jesus said, 'Who do you think will be the neighbor?' And he says." The one who showed mercy toward him. Then Jesus said, do what? Go and do the same. So Jesus is encouraging us with the parable of the Good Samaritan to go out and do the same kinds of work. You see, I would have never gotten through all of this in an hour class last week. Um, then let's talk about answering the pastoral call. We all have a call of some sorts. We all have a giftedness. It sounds as though from you taking this course, the things that you shared about where you feel like God is leading you, at least in the ballpark. You don't have to know specifically that. Um, let's kind of look back at one of the original calls in the early church. It was the call of the first deacons. And in Acts chapter 6, that particular passage deals with there was some rumbling between the Hellenistic Jews, those that had become converts to Judaism, and they were feeling overlooked. Those widows were feeling overlooked in some of the daily servings and portions of giving to them that they needed. So widows at that time, they had no way of making an income. They would probably have depended upon their husbands. Then they would have needed things. And so the church stepped in to take care of them, but they felt like there were some discrepancies in the serving of these particular, this specific demographic of widows. And so uh, in that particular scenario, um, it was a charge for them to go and find 7 individuals that would be able to serve them. This is distinguished from senior pastoral role where one would be preaching and teaching, and it says, hey, we need to devote our times to the teaching of the word the disciples and apostles were, yet find 7 individuals. And from that, we get folks like Stephen, Philip, and others that come along. You could take a look at that passage on your own. And they come along and they offer service to the women. But they still had some high requirements. They needed to be filled with the Holy Spirit. They needed to be a believer in Jesus Christ. They need to have a desire for wisdom and discernment. And if you look at the passages, you also know that they had a passion for serving others and meeting those temporal needs. And so, as a result of that, we get the term diakonos, which is where we get the word deacon, those who serve. Now, it's not just deacons in churches that serve, those who desire to do pastoral care are servants as well. And some modern day examples of that would be what we call Stephen's ministry. Stephen was one of those original 7 deacons in the early church that was used to help and serve those temporal needs. And later on, we find out he was killed at the work of Saul at that time, and his voice and his directions at that time. But even today, we have Stephen's ministries in church where they're actually working and doing some pastoral care, counseling, and care teams within churches that support individuals. So just know that these things can be very, very real today, and know that this was a catalyst to the church growing in the early church is because they were able to meet the needs. If you even go back to Acts chapter 2, I believe it is, where it talks about how their numbers grew in the church. And so all of this adds to the church growth, not just numeric growth, but just growth in faith. So very important. Another passage that's a basis for my encouragement to do pastoral care is James chapter 2. In James 2, James encourages those in verse 14. He says, look, what use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but he has no works? Can that faith save him? And then he goes on to say, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet do not give them what is necessary for their body. What use is that? In other words, James was saying, what good is that? When you sit here and say that you are a believer and you trust Christ, but you don't serve your brothers, you have to go and serve them and give them what they need. And that's addressing the physical and practical needs of parishioners, attendees, others. Not being apathetic and not fulfilling one's obligation to serve others. And some examples of that today would include food, shelter, clothing, safety, domestic violence could be an issue for someone. You, as a pastoral care attender, may be able to find resources to get that man or woman to a domestic violence shelter to protect them. Healthcare support, and like I said about even with people bereaving and experiencing loss, a ministry of presence. And yes, counseling, pastoral counseling. So finding those numerous ways in which you can meet a real need. James really talks about that. So what are some of the real needs we're seeing today in the church? Some of the real needs we're seeing with individuals in the church today that you may encounter in some of your own ministries, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these. One of the things I'm seeing in working in Christian ministry is as a high prevalence of something called OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And again, that's not always about someone touching doorknobs 50 times. I mean, that is a symptom, but that's just one symptom of that. But when we get into things like a religious scrupulosity, a religious OCD, where an individual feels as though their salvation is in danger daily, that they're going to lose it. I'm not saying based on certain faiths, but I'm talking about individuals who ruminate on thoughts of offending God and going to hell over and over and over. And it just, those thoughts just go around until you hear of individuals that say they've been saved or accepted Christ over 100, 200 times, those types of activities. Um, Individuals in the church are not exempt from suffering. So PTSD of all sorts occur with individuals within the church. Grief and loss is common. We're brought in this world and we are guaranteed to leave this world. From dust we are to dust we will return. And so grief and loss is going to happen, but it's not always death. It can be many forms of grief and loss. And so we have to be there to attend to those kind of needs. So suicidal ideation is not void absent in the church. Individuals experience that. They're triggered by that. Guilt and shame of trying to be perfect in religion, high religious standards. Individuals that come out of strong fundamentalist backgrounds may experience this. Social isolation and loneliness. Not out of the ordinary. Individuals experience that. Singleness, then they may feel some sense of loneliness in those situations. So all of these things exist in the church today. And I put these in here because these are ones that are statistically prevalent in individuals in the church today. Um, Also, kind of looking back, if we kind of call back to the parable of the Good Samaritan, how the Samaritan, one who would have been hated by the very audience that Jesus was talking about and would have hated that audience, comes along without regards to who the person was, no identity of the man that was left for dead. And he goes and serves him and cares for him regardless. Well, the same is applicable to the church today. These populations right here need the attention of the church. And I know that there are populations on here, uh, particularly as it pertains to sexual minorities and the LGBTQ community, that will ruffle the feathers of a lot of Christians in terms of how that um, those populations may uh, exhibit behaviors, may exhibit a lifestyle, and even that terminology is sometimes challenged in the world of psychology and counseling, of saying lifestyle as if one chooses, and then whatever the debate is, we're not about to get into that right here on this lecture or in the class, but we know that there are things that are said in the scriptures about this community. And not but, and at the same time, God desires that we serve and care for individuals in every one of these areas, just as we serve the formerly incarcerated, the incarcerated, those that are in jails. We are to serve those that are sexual minorities with pastoral care, love, compassion in those regards. You can have compassion and hold to your convictions. It can happen. Sometimes it's a very fine dance that you do, but you can do it. It is very possible. And it is our role to serve every one of these communities. So these are just some things to think about. And as you look at this list, who do you think in this list is God calling you to serve? And I know some of you shared some that you had last week that you already kind of have a ministry in front of you, and some were like, "Hey, I'm still trying to figure that out." This list here is not exhaustive, but many of these you will have more than an ample opportunity to serve one day. And so we'll probably talk a little bit about this as we go through the course, not just on in our class period, but sometime in the course we'll talk about it. Which populations do you see yourself challenged in answering the pastoral call to serve? Due to lack of experience, your fears, your biases. We'll probably even discuss this in our next class or over the time of our course. And what are your initial reactions as to how you would respond to these individuals? So we will take some time to do that in one of our upcoming courses, but I just wanted to just throw this out there to everyone. Um, this brief lecture here just was not that brief. So I'm glad you're hopefully watch this thing in multiple sections. But this is the basis for why I do pastoral care and pastoral counseling when I've done it. And it's the basis for why I'm a clinical counselor, but I hope that it can serve as a framework for encouraging you and offering that foundation for you as you think about how you're going to serve individuals in the future. Thank you so much, and I hope you glean a lot from this particular presentation.